Okay. All right. Okay. Finally, at long last, we are ready to go. Good morning. Good morning. Okay. So, Parshas Vayeira. Parsha of this week is Vayeira. So we're going to be talking about a really very important and somewhat counterintuitive, maybe, lesson that we have in this week's Parsha, and that is, let's start from the top in the text, page 18 in the Hebrew. Yes. Okay, this is Yafi. So the Gemara learns from this week's Parsha, we have Avram Avinu, who is in the middle of hanging out with Hashem. And then he sees these strangers approaching and he says, hey, Hashem, I hope you don't mind. Can you just hang on a sec? I've got to go take care of these people. Which might seem interesting. And so the Gemara learns out from this that from the fact that Avraham Avinu, who was sitting literally in dialogue with Hashem, chatting with Hashem, asked Hashem to hang on while he goes to take care of these people who are approaching his house, these strangers. From this we learn out that welcoming guests, bringing guests into one's home, Gdola is greater mekabalas pnei shechina than greeting Hashem himself, greeting the divine presence. Question? Huh? Don't be sorry. So, this is what the Gemara says, and the Rambam actually says, says this as a sort of a matter of a final ruling. The Rambam also says, and this is what the Rambam says. And this is the statute that Avram instituted, and the path of kindness that he enacted. Machil over drachim, he would feed travelers, or mashke oson, and give them to drink, or malava oson, and accompany them, or gdola hachnosas orchim mechbalas pnei shechina, and taking care of guests is greater than greeting the divine presence, greeting Hashem. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Vayar v'hinei shlosha anoshim, that Avram Avinu saw there were three people coming, etc. So he saw these three people coming, and he says to Hashem, "Listen, Hashem, hope you don't mind. Do you mind to just hang on for a minute? I'll be back." So now there's something that we're going to have to understand in Rambam. Two things. Number one is, it's very out of character for Rambam to tell us where this comes from, right? If you look in Rambam is a book of halachas. Rambam tells you what to do. In this circumstance, you do this. In that circumstance, you do that. Rambam doesn't tell us all the stories behind everything and where things came from and who we learned from. He doesn't do that generally. So this seems to be very out of character, that when Rambam is telling us about the mitzvah of hachnosas orchim, he tells us about where we learned it from. It comes from Avraham Avinu and the whole story, where it came from and how it happened, etc. It's very, very out of character. And obviously, if Rambam is doing this out of character, there's a specific reason why. So we've got to understand what's the reason that Rambam decided to go out of character about this specifically. And number two is, Rambam himself tells us that, and this is relevant to quite a number of mitzvahs, that when we fulfill mitzvahs today, the reason we fulfill the mitzvahs is because Hashem commanded us through Moshe on Har Sinai to fulfill the mitzvah. The reason that we have that Jewish boys are circumcised is not because Avraham Avinu did it. It's not because Hashem told Avraham Avinu to do it and that his children should do it. It's because Hashem told Moshe at Har Sinai to tell us to do it. It's the same is true with everything. All the mitzvahs that we have, our obligation to fulfill mitzvahs is because Hashem said so to us through Moshe on Har Sinai. Any mitzvah that we were already told before Har Sinai, which would include bris. It includes hachanasas orchim. We learn from Avraham Avinu. It includes, well, that's not a commandment there per se, but we learn it from him. It includes the mitzvah of raising a family, which Hashem told Adam Arishon and Noach, etc. All these mitzvahs that Hashem already told them before, that's not why we have to keep it. We have to keep it because of Har Sinai. We got the Torah on Har Sinai, and Hashem, all those things that Hashem had already instructed before, he instructed again through Moshe at Har Sinai. And this is Rambam himself who makes a very big point of this. And Rambam says it's important to be aware and to understand that the reason you fulfill mitzvahs is because Hashem commanded you through Moshe on Har Sinai, not because of what happened before. So if Rambam himself points that out and emphasizes that the reason we keep mitzvahs is because of when Hashem told us through Moshe at Har Sinai, not because of where it happened before, why is Rambam going and telling us this whole story of Avraham Avinu, that Hachnasas Orchim is so great, and we learned it from Avraham Avinu, and he was the original role model? Rambam himself says that that's not important, and that's not why we keep mitzvahs the way we learn them from. We keep mitzvahs because Hashem said so at Har Sinai. So why is Rambam getting all carried away with this whole, the backstory, right? The origin story of this mitzvah. If Rambam himself says origin stories of mitzvahs are irrelevant, we keep them from Har Sinai, not because of whatever happened before that. So we have two issues here with the fact that Rambam tells us this whole, that rather than Rambam just saying, it's a mitzvah to welcome guests and to take care of them, etc., he told us, and we learn it from Avraham Avinu, and Avraham Avinu had this story with Hashem, and when he told Hashem to wait, etc. It seems, number one, out of character, and it seems like it doesn't actually fit with Rambam's own view on why we keep mitzvahs from Mount Sinai and not from earlier. So we're going to have something that's going to clarify this all for us and going to make these two issues become resolved. So we're going to now talk about another version of this. So this, we quoted from the Gemara. The Gemara tells us that welcoming and taking care of guests is greater than greeting Hashem himself. Rambam tells us the same thing, and that it comes from the story of Avraham Avinu. But there's another variation of this that's a little different, and the important may seem subtle, but it's very significant. And that is, we're up to base now, chapter 2. So in the Hebrew, it's the bottom left column on page 18. In the English, it's discovering sources of law with mystic texts on page 36. So in Tikkunei Zohar, Muva, it says in Tikkunei Zohar, it's brought Rabbi Shimon Omer. Rabbi Shimon says, Zakar iyu man de mekabel erchim b'ru'u shlim. One who welcome, this is Aramaic, though you may notice that the words seem less familiar than Hebrew. It's because they're not Hebrew, they're Aramaic, which is the language in which Zohar is primarily written. That one who receives or welcomes guests joyfully with complete, literally with complete love, with complete dedication, with complete involvement, personal involvement, and being invested in the welcoming of the guests. Zakot, this person merits as though he has the same merit, the same zchus, we would say in Hebrew, as though he welcomed Hashem, welcomed the divine presence. You see the difference between the two? Do you see the difference between the two, between the Gemara and the Rambam versus the Tikkunei Zohar?
Yeah.
What's the difference? Anyone?
From the Joah, it says receiving guests are part of the divine presence. So I guess it's supporting. Hang on.
Question is, what's the contrast? What's the difference between the two?
It's like it comes before, like receiving Hashem, and the other one it's like it's above. It's like it's greater.
Which one's greater?
Like another Rambam.
It's greater than Kobach. Yeah, what it said.
Where does it say it's greater?
In the Gemara.
In the Gemara and the Rambam, it says that welcoming guests is greater than greeting Hashem.
Yeah.
The Zohar says it's as great as. It doesn't say it's greater, it says it's equivalent to, which is a big difference, right? It's a question of two things that are ranked equally versus one thing being ranked above the other. It's a very big difference, and it's an important difference. Question is, what's going on here? Is the Zohar arguing with Rambam and the Gemara? So let's read inside for a little. So we need to understand here, because the Zohar, this Tikkunei Zohar, seems to argue with the Gemara, which is the origin of the Rambam, which says that welcoming guests is greater than Hashem, greater than welcoming Hashem, not equal to. The question is not just why, but that can't really be, because we have a clear pasuk, we have a story. Avram Avinu left Hashem to go greet guests, which means that greeting guests is a higher priority. So when the Zohar, the Tikkunei Zohar, says that it's equal priority, how could it say that? How could it suggest that? So we need to understand what the Zohar is talking about, how and why it argues with the Gemara and the Rambam. And then once we understand that, we will have some clarity in why Rambam is bringing the backstory and Avram Avinu and all of that, which seems to be out of character. So V'yuvan Adover, we're at Gimel now, halfway down the right column on page 19 in the Hebrew, and observing mitzvahs in the spiritual plane, page 37 in the English. So V'yuvan Hadover, this could be understood Bahakdim by first prefacing Bior Madregas Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. First, we need to clarify exactly who was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Where was he up to? What was he like? You want to copy the text? Where are they at? They went around. There you go. It's Hebrew and English. So, are you supposed to be on the list? You need to be marked up? What's your name? Not on this list. Put you on. How do you spell your last name? Okay, thank you. So let's talk about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because the quote in the Zohar, it started out, if you remember, it says, the Zohar says, Rabbi Shimon Omer, that Rabbi Shimon says. And whenever we have a reference in Mishnah, Gemara, etc., to Rabbi Shimon, just to Rabbi Shimon, without clarifying which Rabbi Shimon, it refers to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Stam Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. When it says just Rabbi Shimon, it means Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. That's the Rabbi Shimon it's talking about. So this is a quote from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Once we understand who Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was, things will start to make a bit more sense. So a few things about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. First of all, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was someone who Torasoi umenasoi, which is a halachic term which means someone whose Torah study is their occupation. It means it's what they do. They wake up, they learn Torah, they go to sleep, basically. And there are some halachic things that are different for someone whose Torah is their entire occupation. Some things that their halachic obligations and responsibilities vary to other people's. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai wasn't just someone whose entire occupation was Torah study. He was someone who had an entirely different perspective, experience, perhaps frame of consciousness. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was someone who had a very unusual and unique connection to and relationship with divinity. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai authored Zohar. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was someone whose he experienced the spiritual, in a sense, more so than the physical. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was, you talk about academics. And by academic, I don't mean someone whose job is to be an academic. I mean someone whose entire personality is an academic, a person who lives in their head and lives in ideas. and you can walk past them and they don't even see you. You could talk to them, they don't hear you. They're just up here living in their mind, living in concepts and ideas, right? That's a person whose experience exists in the world of ideas, of information. And the world is, can be largely irrelevant. The person will maybe need to eat so that they don't get hungry and need to wear some clothes so that they're not freezing cold, etc. But so a person whose experience exists in their mind and in the world of ideas and information is generally not going to be particularly interested in or care about, the material things. We're talking about obviously someone who takes it all the way to an extreme degree. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was a similar sort of thing, but for him it wasn't just information and ideas. For him it was spirituality. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's experience was about the spiritual, and that's what he was interested in, and that's what he was aware of, and that's what he cared about, and that's what he noticed. Material world was to him really largely a very distant reality. He physically existed, but it's not where his consciousness was. It's not where his mind was. It's not what his experience revolved around. And he was in touch with spirituality in a way that we are not, and practically speaking, probably could not be. So he was a person whose life was about spirituality in a very, very unique way. And we see it there are a number of different stories and a number of different things that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said and, is quoted as saying throughout the Gemara, etc. And, just for example, when there's a discussion about, work and parents' responsibility to teach their children to be able to support themselves and, to be able to generate an income, have a job, etc. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is just like, forget that, just like learn Torah all day. Just teach everyone to learn Torah all day. Hashem will take care of them. And the Gemara addresses that and says, well, yeah, I don't know about that. And ultimately the point that the Gemara makes is that works for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai because that's who he was. That was his reality. He was able to live in a world of Torah because that was him. But for most people, that's not going to work. It's not feasible, it's not practical, and it's not the right thing for most people. He had a completely different experience. He lived in a different reality. He was a very spiritually in touch person. And the extent to which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was spiritually in touch, it wasn't just a mindset. It was a lot more than a mindset. It was a very real thing. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai actually had a different ability to interact with spirituality and for his actions and his learning, etc., to have a real impact spiritually. And where this plays out is that it says about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and so let's, I guess, take a step back and talk about some basics first. So, we are here. Why did Hashem create the world? Hashem created the world to make a dir b'tachtonim, to have a dwelling place in a material world. Now, if I were to ask you, do angels exist? How many of you would say yes? Hands? Yes. Do angels exist? Okay, very good. A person could respond that angels do not exist correctly according to Torah, depending on what you mean by exist. If what you mean by exist is exist physically, made out of atoms, out of protons, electrons, neutrons, out of physical mass and physical energy, no, they don't. Angels are not physical entities. The existence of angels is not defined by the parameters that define physical reality. So if the question is, do angels physically exist? The answer is no. People can think sometimes that, we talk about spiritual worlds and Atzilus and Bria, etc., spiritual realities. It's the way, what that means is not that if you take a rocket ship and, you fly all the way and you become buddies with Elon Musk and you get him to put you on a rocket and it goes all the way out beyond anything that we know of and you keep flying far enough up, eventually you'll hit a spiritual reality. It's not the way it works. Spiritual realities are different realities. They're not physical. They don't physically exist. that doesn't make them any less real than the physical reality. They're no less real than that which does physically exist. It's just a different reality. It's defined by different parameters. Make sense? So, when we talk about having a spiritual experience, sometimes when we say that we had or when a person says they had a spiritual experience, what actually happened wasn't technically spiritual at all. It was an experience that they would describe as feeling spiritual, but what happened was a physical thing, and there was a series of chemical reactions in their brain that made them feel a certain way, and they describe it as being spiritual. It's not necessarily actually a spiritual thing. Spiritual is not physical. They're two different categories of reality, different realities. Now, Hashem created the world in order for us to introduce divinity, spirituality, godliness into the fabric of the physical reality, which is impossible because spirituality is not physical. It doesn't physically exist. So how are we supposed to take something that doesn't physically exist and integrate it into the fabric of a physical reality? Sorry? The mind is a very important part of it, but let's go deeper into the mind. The fact, when we say the bracha Asher Yotza, it's a bracha we say after using the bathroom. And we say it also in morning brachas. At the end of the bracha, when we thank Hashem for our health, we say, blessed are you, Hashem, Baruch atah Hashem, Roifei chol basar, who heals all flesh, umafli la'asos, and does wonders. Now, when we say does wonders, there are a few things that refers to. Number one is very simply just the biology. If you look at what happens in a single cell in a body, in order for a single cell to be alive and to function effectively, a single cell, if one cell were the size of this room, it'd be filled with thousands and thousands and thousands of little things. It's not like it's just a big empty space. There's thousands, tens of thousands of millions, I don't know how many chemical reactions all happening at the same time, and they're all in perfect balance, and there's DNA replication, and there's protein synthesis, and there's respiration, and there's cleaning, and there's all kinds of things that are going on, and everything's in perfect balance and has to be for the cell to be alive. And if things get out of balance, cells have a built-in process called apoptosis, which means that the cell kills itself, it self-destructs to stop it from messing up the whole body. And that function of apoptosis is necessary because there's so much that has to work with extraordinary precision and perfection within the cell for that cell to be able to stay alive, that it's very, it's not unreasonable that one thing might go wrong to the extent that the cell doesn't function properly anymore and it needs to self-destruct. And that's one cell. Now, our bodies are made up of trillions of cells, making up different tissue types, skin, and muscle and nerve and blood and connective tissue, etc. All of these things, the nervous system, everything interacting with each other perfectly and giving feedback, the systems interacting with each other and informing each other, and everything has to work in perfect balance. It's not a wonder when a body or a person has a medical issue. The wonder is, how is it possible for life to even exist? And for all of this to work together so perfectly across trillions of cells in a body, all working together so perfectly with so much going on and having to be in perfect balance for a person to be alive and healthy. It's like the thought that a healthy person could even exist is crazy. And so when we say that Hashem mafli lasos, Hashem does wonders, for there to be even a single-celled organism alive, let alone a person who's made up of trillions of cells, all working together for a person to be healthy is crazy. That's a wondrous thing. So Hashem does wonders by making us be alive and healthy. That's the simplest layer of meaning when we say we thank Hashem for our health and say that Hashem does wonders. But another layer deeper is that every single one of us has a body and a soul. A person is by definition a combination of body and soul. A body without a soul is basically meat and bones, and a soul without a body, it's not a person. It would look more like an angel than a person. A person by definition is a combination of body and soul, which, if we think about it, should not be technically possible, because a body is a physical entity that's made out of physical mass, physical energy, protons, electrons, neutrons. And a soul is not. A soul is not physical. A soul doesn't physically exist. It's a spiritual entity. It's an entity that's defined by different parameters that don't physically exist. So how can a body and a soul work together in partnership? And that is another thing that we mean when we say that Hashem does wonders. The fact that a person could exist as a combination of body and soul, which are physical and spiritual together as partners, which should be a technical impossibility, is a wonder. Once Hashem has instituted that wonder and created us as a partnership of body and soul, we now become able to do the impossible. All right. And let's say, for example, that, a teacher wants to teach something to a room full of people that don't speak, and the teacher doesn't speak their language. You have a teacher, a professor made a unique discovery and has a very, unique ideas, and really there's a group of people who are interested to hear what this person, this professor or thinker or whatever it is, has to say. The problem is that this person speaks English and they speak Vietnamese. What are we going to do? Simple solution. Find someone who speaks English and Vietnamese and they translate. Bingo. It's not rocket science. Why? Because you have two people or two groups of people, or a person in a group, who, in terms of the languages they speak, are mutually exclusive. One speaks English and not Vietnamese. One speaks Vietnamese and not English. They can't communicate. They can't interact verbally. If we have a person who can communicate with one and communicate with the other, that third party can now facilitate communication across both, because they can understand what one says and then communicate it to the other and do the same back and forth. And we can now have communication between the two groups because there is a third party that is able to interact with both. Because we are made up of a body and a soul, we are able to interact with the world. We have a body that can interact with the world. Our body's physical, it can interact with the physical world. We have a soul, which is spiritual and can interact with spirituality. And because we have this unique and impossible combination of body and soul, we are that interpreter, the translator, the one that can facilitate interaction between the physical and the spiritual, because we have both. We're able to interact with both. And that's ultimately what the world was created for. The world was created as a playground in which we can introduce spirituality into the fabric of the physical world by doing mitzvahs. Every mitzvah has a physical action. It also has a spiritual content, spiritual value. And when we carry out that action as a mitzvah, the spirituality that was carried by the mitzvah becomes imbued on whatever physical entities were involved in the mitzvah. This is true of, and this is why when it comes to things like learning Torah, for example, halachically, to fulfill the mitzvah of learning Torah, we need to actually say the words. Because if we don't say the words, it's an intangible process that happens in our mind. And we're not really including a tangible physical process in the mitzvah of learning Torah. And then we lose out on the introduction of the spirituality, the divinity, the godliness into the physical world, into the physical matter. So we have to do physical action. That's why mitzvahs always have physical actions. They also have a spiritual component that they carry. And mitzvahs, learning Torah, giving tzedakah, kindness, etc., all the things that Torah tells us to do, every time we do any of those things, we're introducing through our soul, from our soul and through our body, spirituality, divinity into physical reality. And this is what it's all about. This is the point of everything, is to bring divinity into the world. The way that we bring divinity into the world is through action, through the right kinds of actions. And, if for a person to sit, if we were to just sit and meditate and think about the right things without acting on them, we'd be missing out on the process by means of which we take all those things that we thought about and actually integrate them into the world. And this is why action is such an important part of mitzvah. And that's why it says in Pirkei Avos, Lo hamidrash ikar ela ha'maaseh. thinking about something, intending to do something, meaning to do something is all nice, but at the end of the day, the most important thing is action, is actually doing it. That's what counts. That's what matters. Because it's the action that introduces the divinity into the fabric of the physical universe, physical reality. So action is super important. Now, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, he was able to experience spirituality consciously in a way that we don't. He also had a very unique ability to actually integrate divinity into the physical reality without having to take the action, which is generally not possible. He had a very unique ability to do this. So he could, by means of thinking, learning, discussing something, talking about it, learning about it, thinking about it, could actually cause the integration of spirituality, of divinity into the physical world, which is generally technically impossible, but he had a unique ability to do that. So on both sides of the coin here, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was in a very unusual pair of shoes. Number one, also first let's just talk about mitzvahs. So when it comes to mitzvahs, generally if we would learn about a mitzvah and think about it and talk about it, that's nice, it's a good start, it's the mitzvah of learning Torah, but we haven't actually done the mitzvah. We haven't integrated the divinity that mitzvah carries into the physical world. We have to actually do the mitzvah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was able to integrate the divinity into the physical world by means of learning, etc. Which means that for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai specifically, the action was not of crucial importance, unlike for everyone else, right? The Mishnah says, Lo hamidrash ika ela hamaiser. Learning is good, talking is good, it's nice. You've got to do the action. Without the action, you don't have the mitzvah. Without the action, you don't have the integration of divinity into the world. That wasn't true for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, it's true for everyone else. So for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, an actual act, enacting a physical mitzvah, isn't as important as it is for everyone else. For us, the action comes first before everything else. That in the context of what we're talking about of Hachnosos Orchim, the act would be the act of welcoming guests, fulfilling this mitzvah. The second side of this is, right, we have here a comparison of two things. We have a comparison of welcoming guests versus Hashem, welcoming, honoring, engaging with Hashem directly. Now for that also, the extent to which Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was able to do that was very different to the extent to which everybody else does it. We can all connect to Hashem, we can all engage with Hashem, we can all talk to Hashem, we can all, pray, daven, speak to Hashem, have our own direct, personal, individual relationship with Hashem, and it's an extraordinarily important thing to do. And it really changes and brings a lot to our lived experience. But all of these things, and part of the reason it's so difficult, part of the reason it takes so much work and personal development, etc., to really build and develop a true personal, human, experiential relationship with Hashem is because we don't sense Hashem with our five senses. We can learn about Hashem, we can become consciously aware of the truth of Hashem, but that's a far cry from the extent to which we experience food and etc., all the things that we enjoy, all the things that we like or dislike for that matter. Right? We don't directly consciously experience Hashem. So we have to use the power of our minds to learn about Hashem, to understand about Hashem, to think about Hashem, to create a sense of awareness and a sense of connection that's built on our minds rather than a physical sense. That's the only option we have. So can we have a personal experiential relationship with Hashem? We can. but it has to be built off of our minds. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was able to interact with and experience spirituality, divinity in a much more direct and tangible way. So for him, Kabbalah's Pnei Shechina, receiving divine presence, interacting with Hashem was a very, very, very different thing than it is for us. Not more important. It's not that ours is less important. It's just that ours is of a far lower caliber, let's say. It just is than his was. So now that we know that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's interaction with spirituality was of an immeasurably higher caliber than ours is, and his dependence or his need to actually fulfill the action of the mitzvahs was less than ours is, because he was actually able to integrate divinity, godliness, spirituality into the physical world through the study, which generally isn't possible. He had a unique ability to do that. So for him, interacting with Hashem, Kabbalah's Pnei Shechina, is much greater than it is for everyone else, and his need to actually fulfill mitzvahs in action was lower than it is for everyone else. So for him, they're on par. So for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, welcoming guests is equivalent to, or equal in greatness, equal in merit to interacting with Hashem directly, to Kabbalah's Pnei Shechina. But for normal people, where our interaction with Hashem is of a far lower caliber than his was, and our priority on the act of mitzvahs, on the act of welcoming the guests versus the concept, the idea, is much higher. So for us, welcoming guests is actually a higher priority than Kabbalah's Pnei Shechina, than welcoming the divine presence, than interacting with Hashem directly. And so this is why what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said is not a contradiction to what the Gemara said. It's not a contradiction to the story of Avraham Avinu. It's just that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was talking about in the context of his personal experience, which was very different. Right? The Gemara says that many people, when it talks about Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai saying that, don't worry about a job and income, just learn Torah all day. The Gemara says, lots of people tried the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai thing and it didn't work. Most people are not supposed to just learn Torah all day and just rely on Hashem taking care of them. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai did, and it worked for him because he was a unique, unusual individual with a unique, unusual circumstance and experience. But the Gemara says that's not for most of us. That's not what most of us are supposed to do, and it's not going to work for most of us. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was talking in the context of his experience for himself, who was a very unique person. So for him, he says that welcoming guests is equivalent in merit to welcoming Hashem, to interacting with Hashem directly. But for everybody else whose interaction with Hashem, whose experience of divinity, let's put it that way, for everyone else whose experience of divinity is inferior to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's, is of a lower caliber, and for whom the importance and priority on action, on actually doing things in order to make a difference in the world, is much higher than his was. For us, the action, the mitzvah of actually welcoming in the guests is greater than interacting with Hashem, than welcoming the Shekhinah, the divine presence, than experiencing godliness. So now, okay, 1 second. I was trying to find where we are in the text to see if we should go inside the text. Right. So Rambam quotes the origin of this story, the fact that Avraham Avinu did this, 1 second, sorry.
No question.
Yeah.
I don't understand like why it's greater if it's like kind of an intermediary between us and Hashem. Like for Rabbi Shimon it's like direct. Like he connects.
What's greater?
I'm saying like inviting guests. Like why do we say that it's greater if it's kind of like in a lower level of Rabbi Shimon? Like if we compare that like connection that he had with Hashem, our like us inviting guests, it seems that it's like less than he's inviting them. Like,
So we're talking about the two things within our experience relative to each other. So there's interacting with Hashem directly, and then there's welcoming guests. So for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, there was his interacting with Hashem and his welcoming guests. And then for us, there's our interacting with Hashem and our welcoming guests.
okay.
Now, because our interaction with Hashem is much lower than his, and our need to welcome guests is higher than his, was for us, welcoming guests is higher than the Shekhinah. We're not comparing that to his welcoming guests or his experience of the Shekhinah. We're talking about, for us, the comparison of the two options within our experience versus the comparison of the two options within his experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So what did Rabbi bring Abraham then? So it seems that Abraham is on the same level, same plane as, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai.
No, not necessarily.
In terms of like welcoming the Shekinah, so it was with like Hashem, right? And then he tells.
Well, no, not necessarily. I mean, that it's we would think that and assume that, but this specific kind of experience of spirituality. See, Avram had a very unique relationship with Hashem and interactions and direct dialogues, etc. But his conscious experience of divinity, it doesn't say anywhere that it was the same as Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's. So this is what. So Rambam brings this to clarify that don't get confused and think that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is that we should follow Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, or that he's arguing. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is talking about in the context of his personal circumstances and the way that he experiences things.
That I get. So why did he bring Avraham Avinu's experiences?
He brings Avram Avinu to illustrate for us that Avram Avinu was a trailblazer, right? We talked about in the mitzvah of bris that Avram Avinu had to pave the way for us, and Avram Avinu fulfilled this mitzvah the way that we're supposed to fulfill it, and he facilitated for us. The reason we do it is not because he did it. That hasn't changed. The reason we do it is because Hashem told us to at Har Sinai. But Rambam is quoting the story of Avram Avinu to illustrate to us that for us, Rambam's telling us, don't make the mistake of thinking that you should follow the description of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Because the description of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is good for him. It's not good for everyone else. Go look back at the story of Avram Avinu, Rambam tells us. Avram Avinu got up and left a dialogue with Hashem to go greet guests. That means that for everyone other than Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, greeting guests is greater than interacting with Hashem, not just equal to. It's equal for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. For everyone else, it's greater. And so Rambam wants to make sure that we don't, that we understand clearly the contrast here. Don't think that when he says greater, it's like greater or equal, greater than or equal to. Where you have the symbol, there's greater than, or there's greater or equal to. It's not greater than or equal to. And maybe it's really like what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, that it's equal to. It's not. Rambam says that was for him. Go look at the story of Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu got up and left talking to Hashem to go take care of the guests. That means that for everyone other than Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, taking care of the guests actually comes before interacting with Hashem, dialogue with Hashem, receiving the divine presence, receiving the Shekhinah. And that's why Rambam quotes this story of Avram Avinu to illustrate and to emphasize the fact that what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said is for him, it's not for everyone else. Avram Avinu, who was the trailblazer, who was an example, showed us what this mitzvah means and what it's about. And when the Gemara says greater than, it means greater than, not greater than or equal to. It means specifically greater than, as opposed to equal to. And that's important. And Rambam wants us to understand that it's not equal, it's greater than. Equal was said by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and it was meant for Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, not for everyone else. So the reason that he's quoting Rambam brings us the story of Avraham Avinu is not because it's not to tell us that the reason we should keep this mitzvah is because Avraham Avinu did it. The reason we keep the mitzvah is because Hashem told us to at Har Sinai. It's just to clarify and to illustrate that when it says greater than, it means greater than specifically. Avraham Avinu literally interrupted a conversation with Hashem and said, hang on a minute, let me go take care of the guests. We have no indication of the fact that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would necessarily do that. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said that it's as great. If they're equal, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai might not have had to get up from an interaction with Hashem to go take care of guests, but everybody else does. And Rambam brought the story of Avraham Avinu to make that clear. That action comes before spiritual experiences. Fulfilling a mitzvah comes before a spiritual experience. And if we were, somehow achieving some sort of actual sensory, personal experiential interaction with Hashem, a dialogue with Hashem, hypothetically, and then the opportunity to actually prepare some food for a hungry guest came along, we'd have to actually stop the conversation, the dialogue with Hashem, and go take care of the guest. That's what Avraham did. And that's what it means. It means that it comes before, not that it's as great as. And that's why Rambam quotes the story of Avraham Avinu, to point that out and to make sure that we don't make the mistake of thinking that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is speaking for us. He's not. He's talking about the context of his own unique circumstances and experience.
Not that we always have like a conversation with Hashem, and like
Have a good week.